This man may look like just another warrior from the old Norse legends, but he was far more than that. Because his story didn't just shape a nation, it ended an era. By the end of this tale, you'll see how one man's final breath at a quiet English bridge marked the death of the Viking Age itself. Harald Hardrada, known as the Hard Ruler, was the king of Norway from 1046 to 1066, and to history, he became the last great Viking. If Harald had not lived the way he did, if he hadn't fought, conquered, and dreamed beyond the limits of his time, Europe's history would have unfolded very differently. His rise and fall didn't only decide who ruled Norway, it decided when the Viking world would finally fall silent. His reign and death didn't just end a man's story, they closed an age that had shaped northern Europe for centuries. Harald was born in the cold heart of Norway, around the year 1015, in a land of forests, fjords, and endless winter skies. His father, Sigurd Syr, was a wise and respected chieftain, known more for patience than pride. His mother, Åsta Gudbrandsdottir, was fierce and ambitious, a woman who believed her sons were meant for greatness. From her, Harald inherited the fire that would never let him rest. And from his father, he learned the quiet strength to endure. But Harald was no ordinary child. His half-brother, Olaf Haraldsson, was already a king, the man who tried to unite Norway under one faith, Christianity. When Olaf died a martyr, people called him Saint Olaf, Norway's eternal protector. That legacy burned in Harald's heart like a flame. As a boy, he grew up listening to stories of his brother's courage, of battles fought in the name of God and country. Every tale planted a seed, a belief that his own life too was meant for something greater. Even in his youth, there was something in Harald's eyes, a mix of calm and danger, like the sea before a storm. Destiny was calling him quietly, but clearly, and though he was still just a boy, the world around him was already shifting, waiting for the day he would rise. At 15, Harald followed his half-brother Olaf into battle, believing he was marching toward glory. The year was 1030, and the air of Norway was filled with smoke, steel, and faith. Olaf sought to reclaim his throne from powerful lords backed by Denmark, and young Harald stood beside him, sword in hand, ready to prove himself. But destiny had other plans. The Battle of Stiklestad was chaos, a storm of spears and blood where brother fought brother, and the earth drank deeply of courage and despair. Harald fought fiercely, but he was still a boy among men. When the fighting ended, his brother lay dead on the field, and the banner of St. Olaf fell. The dream of a united Norway was crushed beneath foreign boots. Wounded and alone, Harald fled through mountains and forests, escaping eastward with only a handful of survivors. Behind him lay everything he had ever known: his home, his family, his future. The boy who had marched out to become a hero was now in exile, carrying scars that would never fade. Yet in that loss, something hardened inside him. The boy who had seen his brother die would rise again, not as a follower, but as a conqueror. Exile did not break Harald, it remade him. After escaping Norway, he crossed frozen lands and endless rivers until he reached Kievan Rus, a kingdom ruled by Prince Yaroslav the Wise. To Yaroslav, Harald was no ordinary refugee. He was a young warrior of royal blood, scarred by defeat but burning with promise. Yaroslav welcomed him into his service, and in return, Harald fought fiercely in his armies, learning new ways of war and command. His victories earned him gold, honor, and the trust of one of the greatest rulers of the East. But Harald's hunger for greatness was never satisfied. The stories of an empire to the south, of marble cities and emperors, called to him. He left the frozen rivers of Rus and journeyed to Constantinople, the heart of the Byzantine Empire. There, he joined the Varangian Guard, the emperor's elite warriors, feared across the world. Harald fought in distant lands, in Asia Minor and Sicily and across the Mediterranean. He crushed rebellions, led men into battle, and watched kingdoms rise and fall. Through blood and brilliance, he rose from exile to legend. The boy who fled. His homeland as a broken survivor became a commander of emperors. In the clash of swords and the gleam of gold, Harald Hardrada was no longer a refugee. He was a ruler in the making. When Harald finally returned to Norway, he was no longer the young warrior who had fled in defeat. He was a man who had seen the world, commanded armies, and spoken with emperors. He came back not as a prince but as a conqueror. His ships were heavy with gold from Byzantium, and his name carried the weight of legend. The people whispered that Saint Olaf's brother had returned, not from exile, but from destiny itself. But Norway already had a king, Magnus the Good, Olaf's illegitimate son. At first, Magnus saw Harald's return as a threat. 2 kings, 1 throne. There could be no peace. Yet Harald's power was too great to ignore. His army was fierce, his wealth unmatched, and his claim divine. To avoid war, Magnus agreed to share the crown with him. For a brief moment, Norway had 2 rulers, one young and kind, the other hardened and proud. Their uneasy peace did not last long. When Magnus died suddenly, Harald stood alone as the ruler of Norway. The exile had become a king. His triumph was absolute, yet behind his victory, a shadow grew, the pride of a man who believed he could never fall. As king, Harald ruled with an iron hand and an unshakable vision. He built, he ruled, he crushed, and he changed Norway forever. The age of scattered chieftains was over. Under Harald's command, power flowed to the throne. He demanded loyalty from every lord, punished rebellion without mercy, and made it clear that Norway would have one ruler, one law, and one will, his own. Those who opposed him called him cruel. Those who followed him called him strong. Both were right. He reformed the kingdom's heart. He brought in coinage stamped with his name, a sign that power no longer belonged to the local chiefs, but to the crown itself. He strengthened trade with England and Denmark, and even kept ties with the empire he once served, Byzantium. The sea routes were alive again, carrying gold, iron, and faith. Harald also built churches and supported Christianity, though he never let priests forget who truly ruled the land. Under his reign, Norway grew rich, disciplined, and feared. But his rule came with a cost. His harshness bred both order and resentment. His victories brought peace, but his ambition kept that peace restless. Harald Hardrada was not just a king. He was a force of will, a man who ruled as if the world itself should bend to his command. Peace never satisfied him. Victory only fed the hunger. Even after uniting Norway under his rule, Harald's eyes turned outward, toward new lands, new crowns, and greater glory. To him, peace was not a reward, but a pause between wars. He wanted Denmark, the rival kingdom that had once ruled over Norway, and for years he waged relentless campaigns to take it. His ships struck like thunder across the coast, his warriors raided deep into enemy lands, and his name echoed through the north as both terror and legend. For 2 decades, Harald fought the Danes, driven by pride and the belief that no man could deny him a throne. Yet even when he won, it was never enough. The victories bled his kingdom of men and gold, and still he refused to stop. Finally, in 1064, after countless battles, he agreed to peace with Denmark, but not because he wanted peace. His ambition had already found a new target, England. Across the sea lay a land divided by rival claims and wounded by politics, a kingdom ripe for the taking. Harald believed it was his by right, through old treaties and royal blood. He began gathering ships, soldiers, and dreams of empire once more. The hard ruler was preparing for his final conquest, one last gamble for immortality. In the autumn of 1066, Harald Hardrada set sail for England with more than 300 ships and the greatest army he had ever commanded. He believed fate itself had called him across the sea. When his fleet landed in the north, villages burned and fear spread like wildfire. At Fulford, near York, Harald met the English earls Edwin and Morcar in battle. The clash was fierce, and by day's end, the Norwegians stood victorious. It was a triumph that seemed to prove Harald's destiny. The last great Viking had conquered again, but destiny can be cruel. Only 5 days later, King Harald Godwinson of England marched his army north with incredible speed. Harold's men, caught by surprise, rested by the river at Stamford Bridge, their armor left behind in the sun. As the English forces appeared over the hills, a deadly silence fell. Harold stood tall, refusing to retreat. He rallied his men, his voice carrying across the field like thunder. The battle that followed was brutal and swift. For hours, the Norwegians fought against impossible odds. Then, as Harald charged forward, an arrow struck his throat. The man who had crossed half the world for glory fell where he stood, and with him, the age of the Vikings ended. The river that day ran red, and the wind carried away the last echoes of 1,000 years of conquest. When Harald fell, the old world fell with him. The roar of Viking longships faded into memory, and the age of endless raids and warriors seeking glory gave way to kings, churches, and quiet kingdoms. His death at Stamford Bridge was not just the end of a man. It was the end of a way of life. The world he had fought to keep alive slipped silently into history. Only 3 weeks later, another battle would change England forever, Hastings, where Harald Godwinson fell to William the Conqueror. The Old North had given its last cry, and a new Europe was being born. In Norway, Harald's sons took his place, Magnus and Olaf, but they ruled differently. Magnus continued his father's strength for a short time, while Olaf, known as the Peaceful, brought calm to a land once shaped by war. He built churches where his father had built fortresses, and treaties where Harald had drawn swords. The storm had passed and the sea grew still, yet the memory of Harald Hardrada never faded. To some, he was the hard ruler who chased glory beyond reason. To others, he was the last flame of the Viking spirit, fierce, proud, and unyielding. His story became legend, and in every tale of courage and ambition that followed, his shadow remained, a reminder that even the greatest kings cannot conquer time. To his enemies, he was a tyrant. To his people, he was a king. To history, he became a legend. Harald Hardrada was more than a ruler. He was the very spirit of an age that refused to die quietly. As a warrior, he fought with unmatched courage, his sword carving his name into the heart of Europe. As a ruler, he commanded with strength and certainty, forging a kingdom from chaos and fear. As an adventurer, he crossed borders and seas, chasing destiny from the frozen north to the golden halls of Byzantium. But there was more to him than conquest. Harald was a poet, a man who could write verses about love, loss, and glory in the same breath he drew for war. He lived not just to rule, but to be remembered. Every act, every battle, every word he spoke was part of a greater song, the song of a man who would not bow to time. In him, the wildness of the old world met the order of the new. And even centuries later, his story still stands unbroken and unforgotten, the story of the last great Viking.